Hello, I'm Dr. Ian Campbell. I have a PhD in global health from the University of Edinburgh, and today I'd like to talk to you about bipolar disorder, insulin resistance, and the ketogenic diet. So, what do we know about bipolar disorder? If we look on the NHS website, we can find four main areas that are described. And one is that there's a chemical imbalance in the brain. There's an imbalance of the neurotransmitters in the brain. Secondly, there's a genetic component to this. So there's a combination of genetic and environmental factors that probably bring about this illness in people. And for those who are genetically susceptible, this can be brought on by triggers such as stressful life events. Mood episodes can be caused by physical illness or sleep disturbance. And there's also established treatments for this illness with lithium, anticonvulsants, antipsychotics. So this is what we know so far, and a person who is diagnosed with bipolar disorder will go on websites and read pamphlets, and this is generally what they will understand about the illness. And today I want to point out some new research that is emerging with bipolar disorder and shedding further light on these areas. And we're going to go through all of these in detail, but to list them, mitochondrial dysfunction, metabolic dysfunction, medication, the mechanisms of action of medication, circadian rhythm, and genetics are areas of major interest at the moment in bipolar. So I want to look at each of these in turn and see what we're learning about bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder is, as we saw in this NHS description, generally understood as an imbalance of neurotransmitters in the brain that needs to be corrected. And we have glutamate, GABA, norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, and these things are all at different levels to what we would find in an average person. And treatment will rebalance the levels of these neurotransmitters in some way that's not fully understood. So if we take a car as an analogy, we might find lots of different things wrong with this car. There's noises, oil patches, engine fumes, car shaking, loss of power. And I think of this a little bit like the imbalance of neurotransmitters in the brain. There's a broad range of effects that we're seeing, and each one is having a slightly different impact. And so when we find a complex system with lots of different problems like this, often we'll look for a root cause for these problems, something that could account for all of these different things. So if we observe this with a car, we wouldn't necessarily try to go to the oil patches and try and clean them up individually, or to, put a filter on the car exhaust so that the fumes are no longer a problem. This is just kind of rebalancing these very individual issues. We would look for a more systemic problem that we can address that's the root cause of all these different things. And in the case of a car, we would find engine failure. If that could be fixed, it could readdress all of these problems at once. And so some researchers are coming to see the brain in bipolar in a similar way, where these downstream effects, these glutamate imbalances and serotonin imbalances, they have a root fundamental cause that is causing this to occur. And this is thought to be, by some researchers, mitochondrial dysfunction. And there is now substantial evidence for mitochondrial dysfunction in bipolar. And when this happens, it causes the neurons in the brain to not have enough energy to keep themselves in balance. And this would inevitably throw off then all of the different neurotransmitters. And similarly, if you could address the mitochondrial dysfunction, it might restore energy to the neurons and automatically rebalance some of these neurotransmitter levels. So let's look at what evidence there is for mitochondrial dysfunction in bipolar quickly. So if we think of a neuron like a car, the mitochondria would be the engine. It supplies the energy to run the cell. So in every cell in your body, there's these mitochondria, and they produce energy in the form of ATP that make all of your cells work. And in neurons, this is the same case. They produce energy for the neuron to work. So what signs do we have that there's dysfunction of the mitochondria in bipolar? In other words, the engine is not running properly. Well, when a car engine is not running properly, you see outputs of that, such as exhaust fumes, and you could think of elevated lactate a bit like this. So we find in the blood and in the cerebrospinal fluid of people with bipolar this elevated lactate, and this is a common observation across quite a number of studies. And there's a good systematic review of this in the references to this talk. And this is a product of increased glycolysis, and we're going to discuss this in a minute. But essentially, it's a sign that the engine in the cell is not running because there's this lactate is being produced in large amounts. Secondly, we see reduced phosphocreatine, which is a common marker of mitochondrial dysfunction. And this is a kind of energy reserve in the cell that's depleted. And this happens when the engine is not running properly, and it starts to rely on this backup energy source. There's also altered serum and CSF markers. So in the blood and in the cerebrospinal fluid, we find markers of dysfunction of this cellular engine, and these are metabolites of the energy-making process. So in other words, there's metabolites that aren't getting burned up in the engine as they should be. They're kind of accumulating. And much like if you looked in an engine and find an accumulation of fuel that shouldn't be there, it's not getting burned up by the normal system. And we also find DNA polymorphisms, which are alterations in the DNA, which are related to mitochondrial function. So in the DNA, that is the kind of design map for the mitochondria. There's some abnormalities in people with bipolar disorder. So these are some of the studies showing this increased lactate, reduced phosphocreatine, altered serum and CSF markers, and mitochondrial DNA polymorphisms. And Cato and Kim have done a lot of work showing this quite conclusively. So the mitochondria can be thought of as like a hybrid engine in the neuron. So your neurons have this kind of hybrid engine system where they have two means of generating cellular energy, and one is called oxidative phosphorylation and the second is called glycolysis. And if we think of oxidative phosphorylation as the main engine, glycolysis would be like the secondary engine, or like the electric power in the car. And this is supposed to run alongside oxidative phosphorylation to provide a bit of extra energy. But when the main engine is shut down, glycolysis runs on overdrive to try and make up for this. It's like the electric engine is trying to make up for the diesel engine not working. And the byproduct of this is that it generates a lot of lactate. So the lactate will build up in the serum. And if it's happening in the brain, it will also build up in the cerebral spinal fluid. And both the cerebral spinal fluid and the serum, the blood of people with bipolar disorder, show this elevated lactate quite consistently across quite a number of studies. So we know that the primary engine is not functioning properly, and this backup engine is running on overdrive to try and compensate for this. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So here we can see on the left, we have the secondary, the kind of electric engine in our analogy. And on the right, we have this primary engine, and this is oxidative phosphorylation. And this part of the process is called the citric acid cycle. And so what happens is you can see glucose at the very top, and this is then converted through multiple enzyme processes into pyruvate. And pyruvate is the fuel. It's like the diesel that then goes into the engine. But when the main engine is not running, as you can see here with the red X, the fuel is not reaching the main engine. There's something happening at this stage that is stopping the fuel reaching the engine. The engine is shut down, and so therefore the pyruvate is rediverted towards creating lactate. So it's burned off in a different way, and this creates lactate. So this is a study by Yoshimi, and he looked at exactly where this citric acid cycle, this main engine, is breaking down, what is happening with it. So the first thing that we see is a buildup of pyruvate, and this happens at the top here. You can see this PDH, which is the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. And this is like a switch that switches the pyruvate from running. It switches, in our analogy, the diesel from going to one engine or the other. So in this stage here, this switch is not working. So we're not effectively switching fuel into this engine, and it's all going to this secondary backup engine. So this is the main reason why you would find an accumulation of pyruvate, is because the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex is not functioning. And we see this in other conditions such as pyruvate dehydrogenase deficiency. And we're going to talk about that in some more depth later. So secondly, we see a buildup of isocitrate and alpha-ketoglutarate. But this is interesting because there's no fuel going into the engine. So why are we finding a buildup of these two secondary metabolites in the system? So here we see the studies showing this, if you'd like to look them up. So why do we find this buildup of alpha-ketoglutarate and isocitrate in this engine when there's no fuel going in? This may be because of a compensatory mechanism that occurs in mitochondrial dysfunction, where when fuel is not making it into the engine, the mitochondria will pull in an alternate fuel source. So this pyruvate in red at the top is not making it into the citric acid cycle, this engine, and it's pulling in glutamate at the bottom here, you can see in the red circle. And what this does is it pulls in glutamate as an alternate fuel source, converts it to alpha-ketoglutarate, then isocitrate, and then citrate, and then this runs the engine. And so it's almost like it's pulling in the fuel and driving it backwards through this engine process compared to how it normally runs. And this is used to reactivate the engine. So in bipolar disorder studies, you can find all the markers of this: elevated alpha-ketoglutarate, elevated isocitrate, elevated glutamate, elevated N-acetylspartate, which is a kind of byproduct of this process and is one of the most reliable markers of mitochondrial dysfunction across quite a number of different conditions. Elevated citrulline, which is another byproduct of this process, and reduced GABA. And glutamine and GABA are in a glutamine-GABA cycle, meaning that when there's raised glutamine, there's usually reduced GABA. And so all of these markers of mitochondrial dysfunction and the adaptive response, which is reductive carboxylation, are observed in bipolar disorder. So we've discovered that there's an engine in the cell that is not working properly, and it's a hybrid engine. It has two parts to the engine, and the main engine is not working properly, and this backup engine is running in overdrive to try and compensate for this. So what would be the cause of something like this happening? So let's look at some further research that's happening with bipolar disorder. And this is related to metabolic dysfunction. So we find very high rates of insulin resistance in people with bipolar. In fact, over 50% of bipolar disorder patients have impaired glucose metabolism, and this is in the form of insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, or impaired glucose tolerance. And this was discovered by a researcher called Kalkin, who was noticing that a lot of her patients with bipolar were coming in with metabolic disorder. So they have type 2 diabetes, things like this. And this has traditionally been understood to be a cause of medication, and certainly some bipolar medications do contribute to metabolic dysfunction. However, she was able to show, and numerous other studies were able to show, that this is actually happening independent of medication, and we'll come back to this in a second. So, bipolar disorder patients are at 2 to 3 times the risk of diabetes of the general population. There's a 1.5 to 1.6 times risk of hospitalization from bipolar disorder in diabetics, and this was from a large data linkage study of over 250,000 diabetics in Scotland in 2001 to 2015. And insulin resistance also has been shown to result in more severe illness in bipolar disorder. You can see this in smaller hippocampal brain volumes and cortical volumes of people with bipolar disorder. They have more damage to the brain if they have insulin resistance, and it's also a feature. It also causes rapid cycling bipolar disorder, which is one of the most severe forms of this illness. I should say it's associated with rapid cycling. So this understanding of insulin resistance in bipolar disorder emerged over quite a long period of time, with it gradually being recognized that this insulin resistance was very common, and it was also not entirely caused by medication. So 2002, we saw increased prevalence of type 2 diabetes in bipolar disorder patients independent of medication. 2012, it was realized there was a 3 times risk of diabetes in BD patients, and insulin resistance was also detected in drug-naive BD patients. By 2015, type 2 diabetics or insulin resistance was detected in over 50% of BD patients in a study, and this was associated with reduced hippocampal volumes. And a lot of this was driven by a researcher called Cynthia Kalkin, who was doing really great research on insulin resistance and consistently documenting in her patients this existence of insulin resistance. And she published this in 2019. Insulin Resistance Takes Center Stage was the name of the paper. You can find the reference here. And just this year, in 2020, a paper came out showing that improvement in insulin signaling results in increased hippocampus and prefrontal cortex volumes in bipolar. So by affecting the insulin signaling pathway, they were able to have better outcomes for a number of patients with bipolar disorder. And we'll come back to this. So you can see in this slide, brain glucose metabolism is compromised in bipolar, and the blue colors on the diagrams are showing areas of reduced metabolism compared to a normal person. So in the depressed state, the global metabolism is about minus 7.7% compared to a normal person. And to put that in context, around minus 10%, you might start to see a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. It's quite a significant reduction in global metabolism. And in the euthymic state, this is normalized, and there's no noticeable difference in this study. So glucose is a fuel for the brain. What is causing it not to be burned effectively in the brain? So insulin resistance is a description of what happens when insulin is not able to pull glucose into the cells effectively. So when we talk about insulin resistance, what we mean is that insulin is not pulling glucose into the cell to be burned in the cellular engines that we discussed earlier. And this is mediated through a pathway, which you can see here. And actually, you can think of insulin a little bit like a gas pump, in the car analogy. Insulin is what's kind of pushing the glucose into the cell to get burned, if you think of it in a sort of simple way. So insulin works through this insulin signaling pathway, and what insulin binds to these IRS, insulin receptor substrates. It then creates this cascade of signals which then control metabolism at the very bottom. So we get insulin binding to these receptors, triggering this cascade of effects that leads to changes in metabolism, such as glucose being taken up into the cell. And normally, if you eat carbohydrates or sugar or something like this, insulin will rise, it will trigger this system, it will tell the cell to uptake the glucose and to burn it effectively. And this happens partly through, if we look at this system, this is exactly the same system we're looking at here in a slightly different way. And we're seeing this pathway through PIP3, AKT, and then AKT, which you can see in this diagram in the middle, then has some downstream targets such as GSK3. And here we can see AKT at the bottom is linked to GSK3. And the next major function documented here is the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. So there's a strong link between insulin signaling and the function of this switch in the engine. And you remember we talked about the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex being a switch that decides if the fuel is going to go into this main engine or into a secondary backup option. So if we have insulin being chronically active, and which is what happens in insulin resistance, then you would expect a chronic suppression of this PDH system. And this is mediated through this GSK3 section. So we have a system that is directly suppressing this flux of fuel into the engine from insulin in the body. And this pathway is detailed in this paper here. The PI3K-AKT pathway regulates metabolism via pyruvate dehydrogenase. So it's a very interesting paper if you'd like to look further into the mechanisms of how this happens. So here we have a potential link between insulin signaling, and the mitochondrial dysfunction that happens in bipolar. And this is the paper that came out in January this year showing it, and it tested brain insulin resistance in adults with bipolar disorder. So there was a degradation happening of the hippocampus in these subjects, and they were losing grey matter essentially as the illness went on for them. But by suppressing this insulin signaling pathway, they were able to have the patients actually keep their hippocampal volume and increase their hippocampal volume compared to patients who were not having this insulin signaling intervention. So it's a very interesting study and provides some evidence that this insulin signaling pathway is implicated in bipolar disorder. So if we break the pathway down here, we have insulin triggering this cascade of effects leading to the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. So we have insulin, which is like the gas pump in the car, and it's chronically overactive. It's not, and this is causing this pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, the switch that lets fuel into the engine, to be suppressed. The fuel is not reaching the engine, and then we have this mitochondrial dysfunction. So we have this metabolic dysfunction, the insulin resistance. And we know that this is very prevalent in bipolar disorder. And we know that mitochondrial dysfunction is definitely happening in bipolar disorder, and this can happen at the level of the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, this switch that is being shut down by this insulin signaling pathway potentially. And we know also that another intermediate stage that leads to this HIF1 is very well understood in cancer metabolism to have this exact effect. It causes this Warburg effect, mitochondrial dysfunction. So insulin travels through this insulin signaling pathway through HIF1, which is well known in cancer research to cause this Warburg effect, mitochondrial dysfunction. And then we also saw how this then causes the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex to be shut down. Fuel can't make it into the engine. So where does medication fit into this? Perhaps not at all, but let's have a look. So if this dysfunction in bipolar disorder is happening because of metabolic and mitochondrial dysfunction, we would expect that the treatments which are very effective from bipolar would have some connection to this insulin signaling system if it's a key part of this mechanism. So let's look at what we find with reviews of lithium action. So if we look at a 50-year review, which is highly cited, of lithium, we find among a few other mechanisms, GSK3 is highlighted as a primary mechanism of how lithium works. And this is considered a sort of key node of lithium action across quite a wide range of studies and reviews. And we know that GSK3 is overactive in bipolar disorder. It's kind of chronically active. And we know that lithium is a GSK3 inhibitor, so it inhibits the function of GSK3. So this is quite widely accepted in the research, and there's a lot of effort that goes into researching GSK3 to try and understand why lithium has such a profound effect on this and how this might be linked to what's happening in bipolar disorder. So if we go back to our insulin signaling pathway, we can see that insulin is coming down through this system. And if you look at the third circle from the bottom highlighted, this is GSK3, which lithium is having its effect on, lithium being a GSK3 inhibitor. So this is part of this insulin signaling pathway. And lithium also exerts an effect on AKT in the same way it suppresses the function of AKT. So lithium is acting primarily perhaps on GSK3 and also on AKT in this pathway, and this is quite widely considered to be a major feature of the action of lithium. So valproic acid is another common treatment for bipolar disorder, and this is also a GSK3 inhibitor, and it's been shown that actually valproic acid and lithium work in synergy to inhibit GSK3. So we have two major medications, at least for bipolar, that are having some influence on this insulin signaling pathway at GSK3. Similarly, again, if this insulin signaling has something to do with bipolar disorder, we would expect there to be some explanation of this in circadian disruption. This is a major feature of bipolar disorder, and it's also a treatment modality. Correcting circadian rhythm dysfunction can reduce mood episodes. So let's look at what's happening with circadian rhythm in bipolar disorder. Circadian rhythms are regulated by a central pacemaker or a biological clock located in the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain. So circadian rhythm is regulated by this central pacemaker. And we know that normal circadian rhythm is disrupted in bipolar. It's a very common feature of bipolar disorder. And we know that there are some genes that have modest associations with bipolar which are related to these mechanisms, and these are clock gene, GSK3, etc. And we also know that lithium has an effect on the circadian period. So there's some interaction, it would seem, between lithium and some of these features and circadian rhythm in bipolar disorder. So we know that circadian rhythm is regulated by this suprachiasmatic nucleus. And let's look to see if there's any features of insulin resistance that could be impacting this system. So we know that lithium is having this strong effect on GSK3, and chronic overactivation of GSK3, which happens in insulin resistance, actually results in the loss of the typical day-night variation of this suprachiasmatic nucleus neuronal activity, the SCN neuronal activity. And this study concludes that these results implicate GSK3 activity as a critical regulator of circadian behavior and neurophysiological rhythms. This next study says that these results support the model that GSK3 activity status is regulated by the circadian clock and that GSK3 feeds back to regulate the molecular clock amplitude in the SCN. So there's a kind of rhythmicity of the active isoforms of this GSK3, and this feeds back into the suprachiasmatic nucleus and regulates the molecular clock that's happening there. So this GSK3 that we see lithium having an impact on is something that's related to the typical day-night cycle. It's related to the main center in the brain controlling circadian rhythm, and it feeds back information to this clock system to define circadian rhythm. It also regulates hippocampal clock gene expression, and it modulates molecular clock gene rhythms in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So this GSK3 is quite strongly implicated in circadian rhythm, and so there's a number of factors, and there's a very large number of factors that influence circadian rhythm, but this is certainly one of them. So we also know that GSK3 inhibition shortens the period of the circadian clock. So similar to lithium, GSK3 has an ability to influence circadian rhythm length. And lithium can phase shift circadian clock by inhibiting GSK3, this study shows. So lithium having this action on GSK3 is also interlinked with circadian function. So circadian rhythm is exerting an influence on GSK3, and GSK3 is exerting an influence on circadian rhythm. And lithium is acting through both of these mechanisms, potentially connecting their function. So we'll have a quick look at some of the genetic information that's coming through. So if insulin signaling is implicated in bipolar, we would expect to see some evidence of this in genome-wide association studies, which are looking at wide ranges of people and their genetic makeup, and it's looking for what abnormalities are associated with certain conditions. So if you look at these GWAS studies, we find that genes related to insulin signaling, such as IGF-1, are associated with bipolar disorder. And bipolar disorder also shares genetic abnormalities with conditions of insulin resistance like type 2 diabetes. And so if we look at our pathway here, IGF-1 is exerting influence on these insulin receptor substrates similar to insulin. So IGF-1 is a major modulator of this insulin signaling pathway, and we see in this study that this has been shown to, it actually has an antidepressant effect if they administer IGF-1 to mice. And there was a cohort of 506 bipolar disorder subjects who went through this GWAS study, and they found this association with IGF-1. So there are a number of features of bipolar disorder that are associated with this insulin signaling pathway, and we don't know for certain that this is a direct link, but it's certainly a lot of the features of bipolar disorder that we understand well show up in this pathway. So if we go back to isolating this, we find at the level of insulin, we have metabolic dysfunction, which is insulin resistance in about over 50% of people with bipolar disorder. We see mitochondrial dysfunction at the level of the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. We see this HIF1 is a primary initiator of the Warburg effect, mitochondrial dysfunction, which is the exact kind of mitochondrial dysfunction happening in bipolar. We find lithium having a strong inhibitory action on GSK3. We find some evidence that IGF-1 is associated with bipolar disorder, which directly influences this insulin signaling pathway at the insulin receptor substrates. And we also find that circadian disruption is being influenced to some extent by GSK3 and vice versa, and that lithium is acting on this same pathway. So what kinds of treatment modalities are available for this insulin signaling pathway? There's two main approaches to this, and one is pharmacological inhibition, which is inhibiting various parts of the pathway, and actually this is exactly what lithium is doing at GSK3. But in studies, they use PI3K inhibitors, which is one of the early stages of the pathway, AKT inhibitors, mTOR inhibitors. This has been used in cancer research, and Lewis Cantley is doing a lot of research on this at the moment, where they're using PI3K inhibitors to stop the Warburg effect happening in cancer. But you can also influence this directly through metabolic factors, such as decreasing glucose and glycogen levels, increasing insulin sensitivity, and reducing insulin levels. And these, give a different input to this insulin signaling pathway in the first place. And sometimes these are used in combination. So Lewis Cantley is using PI3K inhibitors along with a low carbohydrate diet to influence this system at multiple levels. And so the area to look for bipolar would be metabolic. These pharmacological inhibitors are not widely used yet. So let's have a look at how a metabolic approach towards bipolar disorder could shed some further light on this situation. So mitochondria are not only a hybrid engine. We talked before about there being a main engine and a kind of backup engine, but they're also a bifuel engine, because this primary engine, this oxidative phosphorylation, can run on either glucose or on ketones. And glucose is derived from carbohydrates in the diet and to some extent from protein. So when you eat carbohydrates like bread or pasta or potatoes, it's broken down in the body into glucose, and this is burned in this engine through a conversion to pyruvate. So conversely, ketones are derived from fat. So when you fast and you burn your body fat, the fuel that is created from that in the body is called ketones. And this can be from either burning your body fat when you're fasting, or if you eat dietary fat, this is also converted to some extent into ketones. So we have glucose from carbohydrates and protein, and we have ketones from fat, either your body fat being burnt or dietary fat being burnt. So ketosis is when your body switches from, in this main engine, this oxidative phosphorylation, it switches from burning glucose to burning ketones as the primary fuel source. So it's switching between these two alternate fuels that you can use. You could think of it almost like diesel and unleaded. So a way to achieve ketosis is that you can fast and you can just stop eating, and your body fat will burn and it will produce these ketone molecules by burning your body fat. But another way to achieve this is to eat a high level of fat in the diet, and this actually creates these ketones through burning the dietary fat that you've consumed instead of your body fat. So the ketogenic diet is a low carbohydrate, high fat diet that induces the state of ketosis in the body, and by this we mean again that the primary mitochondrial fuel source switches from glucose to ketones. So our biofuel engine is switching from being reliant on glucose to being reliant on ketones. And this has had nearly 100 years of clinical use in epilepsy, and it's a very effective way of reducing seizures in certain epilepsy patients. In fact, you can get about a 50% reduction of seizures in about 50% of people that do the diet, and many people are actually in complete remission from seizures on ketogenic diets. You can find this in almost every kids hospital in the UK. There's a ketogenic diet specialist who will administer this diet to epileptics, and it's not fully understood how this happens, but it has a very profound effect on brain chemistry when you switch the fuel source of these neurons from glucose to ketones. So the diet looks like what you can see in this picture on the left here. It actually looks very much like a normal healthy eating approach. It's just that you don't see it. There's a lot of olive oil added and coconut oil, things like this. And so it's a high-fat diet, 82% fat, 12% protein, and 6% carbohydrate. And what this does is it mimics the state of fasting and burning body fat. So you're essentially creating a scenario in the body that's like what happens when you're fasting, but instead of burning your body fat, you're having dietary fat. And something interesting just to note is that epilepsy and bipolar disorder share some of the same medications. So several anticonvulsants that are used in epilepsy are also used in bipolar disorder. And even though this has been a very successful and widely implemented treatment for epilepsy, there was no reason to consider this for bipolar disorder, and so it's not been imported in the same way that these other epilepsy medications have. So how does the ketogenic diet influence this insulin resistance and mitochondrial dysfunction that we're talking about? So the ketogenic diet tackles insulin resistance at its root by lowering blood glucose and insulin levels. So when you stop eating carbohydrates and you increase your fat intake, this naturally means there's less carbohydrates being broken down into glucose, and this then in turn stops insulin levels rising to take this glucose up into the cell. So you're tackling insulin resistance at its very root by lowering insulin levels in the body, and the ketogenic diet is extremely effective at doing this when done properly. And there's a number of studies where this hasn't been done properly using a ketogenic diet that is formulated from bad fats and things like this. But when you find the correct ketogenic diet being done, it's very effective at lowering insulin levels. Ketones also generate over 20% more cellular energy in the form of ATP per molecule than glucose. So ketones are like a more efficient fuel source in the engine, and per molecule they burn and create more energy than a glucose molecule. Ketosis also increases levels of mitochondrial antioxidants and lowers oxidative stress. So these are two major problems in bipolar disorder. There's high levels of reactive oxygen species being produced in the mitochondria, and this creates damage and various problems. And ketosis is very effective at raising this antioxidant called glutathione, and this lowers the oxidative stress happening in the mitochondria. So if we look at a mitochondria in a normal state and in this mitochondrial dysfunction state, the Warburg effect state, you can see on the left here that both the engines are running correctly, everything is in its right place. But when we have this breakdown on this, remember we talked about this switch that switches where the fuel will go between the two engines, and this pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, this switch is broken in bipolar disorder. It's not functioning to some degree, which we saw earlier, and so the engine is not running properly. So let's look at how ketones interact. Glucose, we can see here, comes in from the top and is not making it into the engine when this switching system is broken. So if we look at this same diagram in a different way here, you can see at the top, glucose comes down, it goes to pyruvate, it goes into the mitochondrion, and it cannot get through into this TCA cycle, this smallest circle, which is the engine, and it's being blocked by this switching system, the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. But if you look at the bottom, ketones, and the main ketone body is called beta-hydroxybutyrate, and this is what you can see at the very bottom here. And you can see that this comes into the mitochondria, it goes through acetoacetate, and then it's acetyl-CoA, and then it's converted into the same fuel that goes into this citric acid cycle, this engine. So you can see that when the main fuel source, the pathway that it takes is blocked, this backup fuel source, this ketones, can come in through a completely separate pathway and go into the engine regardless of whether this switch is working or not. So we know that the ketones are bypassing this switching mechanism because the ketogenic diet is the standard of care for pyruvate dehydrogenase deficiency, where this switching mechanism is kind of permanently damaged and is not working at all. And if you put them on a ketogenic diet, these ketones can run the mitochondria and reactivate the system. And it helps to reverse the Warburg effect, which is exactly this type of mitochondrial dysfunction happening in bipolar. The ketogenic diet can reduce insulin levels and significantly improve hyperglycemia, which is too much blood glucose in type 2 diabetes. And it can improve insulin sensitivity. And something else that's interesting about the ketogenic diet is it works for a number of conditions where insulin resistance is a cause. And one of these is polycystic ovary syndrome. There's a high prevalence of bipolar disorder in people with polycystic ovary syndrome. And interestingly, the risk of bipolar is reduced in polycystic ovary syndrome if you put the patients on metformin. So people that have this condition that's caused by insulin resistance, if you put them on metformin, which lowers the blood glucose through medication, they actually are at a reduced risk of getting bipolar disorder. And also the ketogenic diet is very effective in polycystic ovary syndrome. So the ketogenic diet is having a very profound influence on both insulin resistance and mitochondrial dysfunction. So it's having an influence on the level of this gas being put into the engine. You know, we talked about the pump being like insulin. And it's also having an effect on the engine itself by providing an alternative fuel source in this bi-fuel engine that we talked about, glucose and ketones being the two different types of fuel. So it has a very profound impact on both mitochondrial dysfunction and on insulin resistance. And there are some case studies in bipolar disorder of a ketogenic diet being used. The first one that I'm aware of is by Malik, who noted remission of symptoms in 2 bipolar patients on a ketogenic diet. He noted that within 2 or 3 days of achieving ketosis, the patient's symptoms resolved and she felt a sense of calm, confidence and kindness, she says. And she felt more comfortable in her skin than she did when on medication before. So this was a small kind of a pilot case study, and the kind of torch of this research has really been picked up by Christopher Palmer, who is a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School. And he's been treating patients with a ketogenic diet for quite a number of years, I think around 15 years. And he started to publish case studies on what is happening with these patients when they're on the ketogenic diet. And he's seeing effects in both schizophrenia and in bipolar. And this was a case study he recently published of 2 schizoaffective patients who achieved remission of symptoms on a ketogenic diet. And it's worth reading these studies to see that there's a kind of dynamic where the switch from glucose to ketones takes 2 to 3 days, and they note this shift in mood stabilization happening over the same time period in these studies. There was a recent case study published in Bipolar Disorders Journal where it noted significant improvement of symptoms in a bipolar type 1 patient on a ketogenic diet. She says, after starting the diet, I felt the leaden weight of depression lifted from me. Since then, I feel more joy and I can accommodate better to my life as it is. To summarize, I feel a clear improvement on both depressive and manic aspects. So there are some emerging case studies, and there's an increasing amount of research in ketogenic diet in psychiatry in general. There's a number of papers come out in the past few years looking at this. So when I was researching this, one thing that I noticed is that the ketogenic diet is actually used quite widely in the online bipolar disorder community. And so I published a study in the British Journal of Psychiatry Open detailing this, where we developed this text mining script that then trawls all of these online forums of bipolar disorder. And we just tried to get an idea of how commonly is this being done by people with bipolar disorder and what are they saying about it. So at the time, there's 165 reports. And this was people trying a ketogenic diet for bipolar disorder because they'd heard through word of mouth that this had worked for someone else. So we found that there was 20 reports that basically were claiming a remission of symptoms while on the diet. So this was about 12% of the reports. There was 44% of the reports, 73 reports reporting significant mood stabilization while on the diet, and this was defined as mood stabilization better to that had been experienced prior. And there was 29% of reports, 48 that reported some mood stabilization while on the diet. And so this can obviously be a reporting bias where people that try the diet are more likely to, people that post about the diet are more likely to have had a positive experience, making them report about it. So we then controlled for this by looking at different types of diets that people talk about in these forums. So the two other biggest kind of dietary interventions that were mentioned were omega-3 supplementation, which would potentially be more prone to a placebo effect because there's good evidence supporting this. And a vegetarian diet was just something people also tried in this forum. So we controlled against both these other types of diet, and the reports were much higher and more significant for a ketogenic diet for the categories of mood improvement than both other diets that we looked at. And we also replicated the study across multiple forums to show that there's no one forum influencing this view. It's kind of widely reported across the forums. So some of these reports are very detailed, and they describe mood stabilization lasting from months to years, and quite specific details about how the improvement occurred that are quite consistent through the reports. So here's an example of one. This person says, "I'm cured on a ketogenic seizure control diet. I'm off meds since a few years. I am stable in a way that I can now drink liters of coffee without getting manic. Working 12 to 14 hours concentrated and focused if needed, but being able to also just sit there and admire the calmness and beauty of the moment without any urges or thinking loops." This report says, "After 2 days, my mood's entirely stabilized. After 2 weeks, I feel markedly less anxious and also just generally more clear-headed, and I'm verbally much more articulate. And I'm no longer getting the constant ups and downs of carb energy. Instead, I'm really consistent throughout the day and really only get tired when I should be getting tired before bed." So this kind of 2 days for the effect to happen is also quite widely reported in these reports. There's an adaptation period that's kind of popularly known in the ketogenic diet community called the keto flu, where you are adapting to switching this fuel source from glucose to ketones. And so it takes a while for this to take effect, and usually 2 to 3 days is what's reported in these. It was reported in the Malik case study, but also in these online reports. So again, these are just anecdotal reports and you can't give a lot of weight to them, but it's certainly interesting to see how commonly adhered to this is. In fact, there's even forums and websites and blogs that are devoted just to this subject. There's people that write blogs on this. There's people that make YouTube videos about it. There's forums that are just talking about this subject. There's even now speakers that are going around and talking about this, and we'll come back to that in a second. So another person, Bipolar 2 here as well. "I will die without keto. When I'm off keto, I constantly have to be taken to hospital for intense anxiety attacks and depression, and it's like a miracle that I go months without hospitalization when I'm on keto. I find it hard to stick to, but I hope this is my last go around. I'm on a low dose of lithium, being stable for the most part, able to keep a job as well, so goddamn thanks, keto." There's a number of reports like this. So whether or not this is actually having an effect on bipolar disorder, we do know that the ketogenic diet has a direct effect on this insulin signaling pathway at the level of insulin. So there's a number of areas of research in bipolar that are converging on this pathway. So we have this metabolic dysfunction at the level of insulin leading to mitochondrial dysfunction at the bottom in the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. So looking at all the features that converge on this insulin signaling pathway, ketogenic diet is certainly having an influence at the level of insulin. So there's a number of different groups of people taking interest in the ketogenic diet for bipolar disorder. This is Carrie Brown, who was simply doing the diet to try and lose weight, and she said that she noticed a shift in her mood symptoms, and she persisted with the diet and is now, she reports that she's in remission of bipolar 2 whilst on the ketogenic diet, and she's going and giving talks. And this is gaining a lot of traction in the bipolar community. This video has 15,000 views. And she's very convinced that this is what has put her into remission and is trying to share this message with other people. So whether or not the ketogenic diet works for bipolar disorder, there's another aspect to this, which is the safety. Quite a large amount of people with bipolar disorder are seeing this as a potential therapy for their condition and are trying it themselves. And so from a safety perspective, this is certainly of interest. Psychiatrists using the ketogenic diet, Dr. Chris Palmer from Harvard Medical School has been using ketogenic diet for quite a long time in his practice to treat people with mood disorders, and he is starting to publish case studies on this. So he's published quite a number of case studies with schizophrenia, and he's also now published this case study we looked at with schizoaffective 2 patients. And so he very strongly believes that there's a metabolic component to bipolar disorder, and he's written about this on his website, Chris Palmer MD, and he's really been a pioneer of this research and taking metabolic approach to treating psychiatric illness. Cynthia Calkin, who was the kind of major person to highlight insulin resistance in bipolar disorder, She's a professor of psychiatry at Dalhousie University, and she now runs this mood and metabolism program where she collaborates with an endocrinologist and they tackle psychiatric illness with a metabolic approach. So at the level of insulin, they're influencing it through diet and through various metabolic approaches, almost like you would do with type 2 diabetes. So Stanford have just set up a metabolic psychiatry clinic, and this is led by some quite prestigious scientists from Stanford. They've registered a clinical trial in bipolar disorder that they're now recruiting for. So they want to explore the ketogenic diet, mood stabilization effects in bipolar disorder. And they're specifically recruiting patients that are obese or overweight to explore this metabolic component to the illness. And this is led by Shebani Sethi Dalai and Terence Ketter. Terence Ketter is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences emeritus, and Shebani is a clinical instructor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences. And she also has a private practice that she's opened that is looking to treat people through a metabolic approach. So what are the next steps in this area of research? So Stanford have a randomized controlled clinical trial of the ketogenic diet in bipolar disorder happening. And to get more of these happening, we need more case studies of patients who are doing a ketogenic diet or a metabolic therapy for bipolar disorder and measuring their mood symptoms. So this could be done through things like ecological momentary assessments of mood, whilst measuring blood ketone and glucose levels and seeing if there's a correlation between the mood state and the glucose and ketone levels. And this would then kind of build a further case for more randomized controlled clinical trials of this therapy, and we could really get to the bottom of it. Is this having an effect or not? The other aspect is looking at the insulin signaling pathway, and we looked at that study earlier, which was modulating the insulin signaling pathway, and it's finding that this was related to hippocampal volume in bipolar. So studies looking at this insulin signaling pathway and how lithium interacts with GSK3 and how this interacts with circadian rhythm, these are all areas where insulin resistance could be implicated. So it'd be very interesting to see more studies on this insulin signaling pathway and how it relates to features of bipolar disorder. So thank you very much for listening. If you would like to read more about this, there's a paper I recently published that goes into some more detail and some more depth on these mechanisms. And you can contact me at my email address here. And if anyone, this is more of an academic talk, but if anyone is listening to this who has bipolar, it has to be advised that you don't take on any of these interventions yourself, but always speak to your psychiatrist first before making any major change in your lifestyle like this. And certainly this is the advice of every researcher and psychiatrist who's working on this, is to speak to them first before making any drastic changes. So thank you very much.